In this episode, I'm going to tell you two stories from historical hauntings in the northern United States. The first is about a haunted Alaskan hotel that's so active it has over 3 dozen ghosts at any given time. The next set of stories are from Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, formerly called the State Lunatic Asylum at Danvers. Get comfortable. Let me tell you a story. The historic Anchorage Hotel, located in downtown Anchorage, Alaska, is 107 years old and is said to be one of the most haunted hotels in the state. Alaska is full of terrifying stories. The climate itself makes it one of the easiest places to die in our country. The brutal and unpredictable weather plays a big part in that even today. Alaska is our least tame state, and it was quite the wilderness back in the gold rush days. This lawless frontier was ripe for misdeeds, and as we know, when misdeeds result in deaths, we often end up with paranormal activity. The historic Anchorage Hotel is an unassuming building you might miss walking past. Just an annex of what is left of the original hotel. It was built in 1916 as people poured into Alaska looking for gold and glory. The first owner employed a young boy as a bellhop to carry luggage for hotel guests. He would often be seen going back and forth from the train station, heavy bags and cases in tow. He is seen still, moving heavy bags down the hallways. A guest shared her encounter. My daughter and I were leaving our room for breakfast, and she forgot her wallet in the room. I stayed in the hallway, and she went back into the room. Looking down the length of the hallway, I saw a young boy, maybe 9 years old. He was walking towards me, but something was off. His clothes were not modern. He was wearing a messenger boy hat and was carrying a big bag, like a suitcase, but it wasn't a normal-looking suitcase. He had no expression, and as I turned to face him, he veered to the left and walked directly into the wall of the hallway and disappeared. He just vanished. My daughter opened the door as he disappeared, so she didn't see him. It all happened so fast. She asked me what was wrong, and I told her, I think I just saw a ghost. Thinking back, I couldn't hear him coming down the hall either, and the floors echo as you walk. It's an old building. Children are frequently seen and heard in the hotel, but aside from the bellboy, their identities are unknown. Guests report hearing footsteps, giggling, and children whispering. A guest had the following account. After a long day sightseeing, I was looking forward to getting into bed and relaxing. My wife heard a light knock on the door, and we stopped to listen. There were footsteps running in the hallway, and we figured some kids were just being kids. After a few minutes, we heard knocking again, but this time there were 2 sets of knocks. I figured I had to answer this time and dragged myself out of bed to shoo the kids away. As I reached the door, I heard giggling and little footsteps running away. But when I opened the door, there was nobody there. Looking down the ornate hallway, I wasn't sure what to think. I rationalized they'd probably snuck into their room, and I hoped that was the end of it. Before I even got back into bed, I heard another round of knocking, but this time louder. I was near the door now and threw it open. I heard more giggling and footsteps, but there was nobody there. The light in the hallway was flickering now. I was confused, but figured the sounds must be echoing through the hallway. I closed the door and called the front desk. I asked them to speak to whichever family on our floor that had kids to stop the prank knocking. The front desk said they would send someone to look, but there were no children staying in the hotel at the time. There was an awkward pause on the other end of the line. Then the lady said, "Sir, this hotel has a reputation for being haunted." I didn't know what to say to her, so I just said, "Okay, thanks," and hung up. The next night, we only heard one knock, but I didn't answer the door anymore. I know what we heard and didn't see. Another guest had a heart-stopping experience. I was on vacation in Anchorage and had just come back from lunch to get a heavier jacket, as I knew I'd be out most of the day and evening. I hadn't been drinking, so I know what I saw was real. First, my room had a chair and desk in it, but I never had a need for them since I was on a real vacation, not a work trip. I don't think I ever even sat in that chair during my whole stay. But when I got in that afternoon, the chair was in the middle of the room, facing the large closet. I thought it was odd, but figured it had just moved at some point, probably by housekeeping, and they'd just forgotten to move it back to its place under the desk. I moved it away from the closet and back under the desk and took off my lighter jacket. I reached for the closet door and swung it open. There, in the closet, was a small child, entirely transparent, facing directly up at me, smiling. I jumped back, heart pounding. As I did, she giggled and disappeared. I could still hear the little girl giggling after she disappeared. My mind could not process what I'd seen, and I stumbled backwards and out the door. There was a couple in the hallway, just passing my door, and I must have looked shaken because they asked me if I was okay. Embarrassment be damned, I told them about the little girl, and they looked at each other. "That's amazing," the woman said. Apparently they were ghost hunters and asked me about what I'd seen. Until that point, I had no idea the hotel was haunted. I told them I'd be checking out that night, and they said they were going to ask to switch to my room, room 217. This poor guy had no idea he was staying in one of the most active rooms in the hotel. Another very active room is number 215. A guest who stayed in that room recounted this chilling story. I stayed in the hotel knowing full well about the history of the hauntings, and that's why I stayed there. I asked for haunted room 215, and it was available. I got a lot more than I bargained for. I had my sound recorder and was videoing the room at the same time. It was evening, but not very late. I sat on the bed and asked if there was anyone that wanted to come forward and have their presence known, that I was interested in hearing or seeing them. In that instant, I felt like someone or something was standing behind me. It felt like a heavy presence, something that was not happy I was there. I could feel all the tiny hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and the temperature in the room dropped. It was cold all around me, and my heart was racing. I turned to look behind me, but saw nothing. The room was visibly empty. My head started hurting, and I suddenly felt very sad, like real grief from out of nowhere. I waited for a few minutes, the whole time feeling this terrible, sad uneasiness. I finally couldn't take it anymore, and I reached for my recorder. As I did, a framed picture on the wall suddenly flew off the wall and smashed against the opposite wall. I grabbed my stuff and ran out of the room. I went outside into the cold to clear my head, really feeling like something bad had just happened. It was definitely a flight or fight moment, and I had chosen flight. I played back the recording and felt a pit in my stomach. As I was talking into the room, a white mist started taking shape behind me and leaned over, looming over me, then wrapping around me for a few seconds. It materialized into the shape of a tall woman in white, just looming over my shoulder, and for an instant her face was directly next to mine. She leaned farther over me, and then the mist dissipated, and that's when the picture flew across the room. This spirit had been less than an inch from me, looming over my shoulder, intentionally close to me. My recording clocked the whole event at 8 seconds, but when I was in that room feeling awful, it had felt like 10 minutes at least. I had come here for this, but that whole experience was a lot to handle. I had to tell the front desk what happened to the picture, and the lady didn't skip a beat. "It must have been our ghost," she said. This paranormal investigator likely had an experience with the infamous ghost bride that is seen regularly at the hotel. She's believed to be a young woman whose fiancé was a gold miner. They were getting married in the hotel, and he struck it big the day before the wedding. To keep from having to share his big score with his new bride, he never showed up for the wedding. The bride-to-be was so devastated that she hanged herself in the hotel. She is seen frequently throughout the hotel to this day. Most reports of her by both guests and staff are glimpses and reflections of mirrors, windows, and glass-covered pictures. Her sightings are terrifying because when she is seen, she's usually directly beside you, but you can only see her in the reflection. She's also been seen along the edges and corners of the long hotel hallways, just disappearing out of sight in her white wedding dress. Another ghost that's believed to haunt the historic Anchorage Hotel is the former police chief, Black Jack Sturgis, who was shot in the back of the head with a bullet from his own gun in the alley outside the hotel. He was found and dragged out of the alley, but only died shortly thereafter. His murder remains unsolved to this day. It's believed his ghost haunts the location of the crime, seeking justice or maybe revenge. Guests report seeing him in the alley and throughout the hotel each year on the anniversary of his death. Another terrifying occurrence that's been reported is described by this guest. "I was walking to my room, and I remember looking down at my phone. Suddenly, I felt like I was being watched. When I looked up, I saw movement on the wall just ahead of me. I stopped and saw the shape of a face bulging from the wallpaper. I was so stunned, I couldn't even breathe. The whole wall kind of surged and bent, and then the face just disappeared. Honestly, I thought I was overtired, or maybe I had just imagined it. I was telling my friend about it, and the housekeeper was in the hallway. She popped her head in and said, they see the faces pretty regularly." I had heard the hotel was haunted, but since I've never actually seen anything like that before, I was totally shocked that I actually saw something. Psychics have been separately invited to visit the hotel and have confirmed estimates of almost 36 ghosts that come and go. One ghost of a man even follows each new guest in as they enter the main doors to the lobby. Footsteps, voices, whispers, faces in the walls, full-body apparitions. Would you stay at the historic Anchorage Hotel? If you enjoyed that story, I'm glad you found me. I tell creepy stories about scary encounters and paranormal events. If this is your thing too, stay, listen, and subscribe to Lady Grimm for more stories. It's okay to keep the lights on. Let me tell you another story. Our second northern haunted location is Danvers State Hospital in Danvers, Massachusetts. It was originally called the State Lunatic Asylum at Danvers when it opened its doors in 1884. Before we get into the haunting, I need to share some history about the asylum first. The area it was built, about 21 miles north of Boston, is actually part of Salem Village. Yes, the Salem witch trials Salem. The property where Danvers State Hospital was built was actually Hawthorne Hill, the home of John Hawthorne, one of the most notoriously cruel magistrates involved in the persecution of the Salem witches. The hospital's location was chosen because it was a beautiful rural area, off the beaten path, close to the city, a place where the state of Massachusetts could send its mentally ill. It started as a noble yet fumbling response to the state's mental health issues. The intention of the hospital was to rehabilitate and eventually cure the mentally ill inside these specially made facilities. Dr. Thomas Kirkbride, a leading psychiatrist at the time, advocated for asylums to be built in rural settings where patients could benefit from clean air and sunshine while still contained in an institutionalized setting. Many of the psychiatric hospitals built at the time in the U.S. imitated this sort of grand, self-sustained building style, often with that open bat-wing style of architecture we see in horror movies today. When its first patients arrived in 1878, the asylum had 40 buildings, which included the main wards, an administrative building, a farm, gardens, a slaughterhouse, creative workspaces, a medical laboratory, and a water tower. The official capacity was listed as 450 patients. Word spread that treatments were working. The hospital had treated 9,500 patients. But by 1920, its population had swelled to over 2,000 patients. The administrators were in desperate need of state money to build more rooms and hire more staff. When they were denied, conditions deteriorated horribly. Patients stopped improving, and their living conditions became horrifying. Without enough staff to help, patients lived in their own filth, often walking the hallways naked. Shock therapy was used liberally, and patients were often put in straitjackets and forgotten. When these control methods weren't enough, the lobotomies started. If you don't know, a lobotomy is a practice which involved plunging an ice pick into the back of the eye sockets to sever connections in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, thereby pacifying a patient. Lobotomies were performed with such regularity that Danvers became known as the birthplace of the lobotomy. These procedures were done to treat a wide range of patient symptoms, anything from daydreaming to violent schizophrenia. This became a standard procedure in treating mental illness in the 30s and 40s. With all this, the deaths started piling up. The overcrowding was so bad that patients were often found days after they had died, as decomposition set in. The surgeries themselves resulted in many deaths. In a single year, 278 people died at that hospital. With so much death and abuse, the hauntings started. Gerald Richards was a hospital administrator there in the late 1940s and early 50s. He lived on the premises with his family, his wife, and 3 children. His daughter remembers seeing a ghost in the attic of the house where they lived. The children used to play in the attic until they saw her. She was an elderly woman, angry, and she would often scowl from the corner at the kids as they played. She also claimed to have been awakened several times by the same angry old woman, slowly pulling the covers off her bed. Inside the hospital, staff people reported seeing objects move on their own and hear voices and screaming. According to a former maintenance worker at the hospital, a 15-year-old boy with a habit of crawling into the heating ducts was transferred to a different ward. After about 3 weeks, he disappeared. After searching and not finding him, they assumed he'd escaped. But when the staff in his new ward noticed a horrible smell getting worse and worse every day, they opened the ductwork. The ductwork which went right down to the heating coils. He must have slid down, got trapped, and died. His feet landed right on the coils and literally burnt off up to his shins. When they broke through the walls to remove him, the boy looked like he was frozen. When the pathologist reached in to take him out, his hands literally sunk into his chest. You have to wonder how long he screamed before he died. This same worker reported that bodies were often used in experiments before being buried. He recounted seeing all manner of parts floating in formaldehyde at the hospital labs. Patients could assist in the lab if they were able, and at times would be tasked with dissecting tissue for the doctors. The worker reported seeing baby fetuses, limbs, and organs, and that the doctors were always working on something. Patients would regularly escape, and local residents would be notified by the police, warning them to keep their doors locked until the escaped patient was found. Remember, this was back when people didn't bother to keep their doors locked. The state finally intervened, and portions of Danvers State Hospital were shut down in 1969. Eventually, it shut down permanently in 1992, after the remaining patients and staff were moved to Tewksbury State Hospital, which also has a gruesome history. Danvers sat vacant for several years, during which people would regularly be caught trespassing and urban exploring. Paranormal investigators claim to have captured electronic voice phenomenon, or EVPs, of spirits saying, "I live here," and "I am warning you." Danvers PD was called to the grounds repeatedly after locals heard screaming, only to find nothing. In 1997, a dog walker stumbled across a cemetery on the grounds. 770 numbered graves were found. The dead were buried nameless. There may be more buried there than the estimated 800 people who died at the hospital. It was common for institutions like these to simply number graves, further dehumanizing the people they were supposed to be caring for. The same maintenance worker said that families were notified when a patient dies, but they'd rarely attend the funerals. In 2001, parts of the hospital were cleaned up to film the movie Session 9. The movie is about a crew hired to clean asbestos from an old asylum when bad things start happening. When asked about filming Session 9 at the Danvers State Hospital, David Caruso, the star of the show, said, "It was a place you never get comfortable in. It was always scary. You can really feel the pain of the people that went through Danvers. It's a rough environment. It's not fun. It's on the film. They didn't have to dress any sets or anything. All that stuff was just sitting there. The federal government walked away from it about 30 years ago. It was a terrifying location. Those brave enough to sneak onto the property while it was vacant reported a number of paranormal experiences, from footsteps to doors closing, objects moving, cold spots, moaning, screaming, whispers. It's all there. Here's one terrifying experience. We found the tunnels and followed them in a ways. We had flashlights, but the light never seemed to be enough. It was like the light was just being sucked away from wherever we walked. I stopped to get my bearings and heard someone whispering the word, "No." Sound came and went like the person was moving around nearby. When we heard that, we ran out of the tunnels, and the door slammed behind us. We were nowhere near it. There are actual tunnels and subtunnels under the hospital. It's believed that they were used to move patients around the grounds in the winter months. But one rumor persists that administrators use the tunnels to keep the more violent patients out of sight, maintaining the quiet, mostly serene atmosphere, especially when state officials would visit. The tunnels were quite active with paranormal activity, and it's believed they still are. Today, those tunnels sit under high-tech luxury apartments built by a developer. Yes, you heard that right. Danvers State Hospital, or the grounds where Danvers State Hospital used to be, is now a modern apartment complex. The land was sold to the developer under the condition that the hospital cemetery be maintained. If you go there now, you'll find a memorial and a couple of benches. The cemetery is there too, and so are the dead. Although the famous Kirkbride building was placed on the National Register for Historic Places in 1984, the developer received a demolition permit and built several apartment buildings, leaving the facade of the administration building standing. But just after some of the first residents moved in, a fire destroyed 4 of the new apartment buildings. The fire was investigated, but never solved. The property has since been sold again, but remains an apartment complex. People who have stayed there report quite a bit of poltergeist activity, and a strange, heavy feeling there. One person said she was visiting a friend and saw a man in what looked to be a hospital gown standing near the entrance of the lobby, just looking down at the ground. When she blinked, he was gone. Others have reported seeing the gowned people too, but they vanish when they're approached. If a person survived a lobotomy, they would be a shadow of their former self, often devoid of emotion, similar to these apparitions. One man who said he stayed there visiting his brother for a few weeks regularly saw a young man crawling in the hallway of their apartment. If they moved or spoke aloud, the man would disappear. If they were still and just watched, the man would crawl down the hallway and sit against the wall, then lean backwards, slowly tapping the back of his head against the wall. But there was no sound at all. When you moved, he would disappear. Once the visit was over and the man left, his brother said he only saw the man twice again before he moved out. A woman who regularly walked her dog on the grounds encountered a man near the cemetery sitting on a bench dressed in simple clothing. He waved to her enthusiastically until she waved back, and then he vanished in front of her. Her dog would not go near the bench, and she started taking her walks away from the cemetery. People still hear screams, wailing, and moans all around the grounds. The cemetery is especially eerie when you consider how many people were namelessly buried there after a lifetime of suffering. At least 770 people entered that institution and never left.